Hello, and welcome to Hey, I Like, the show where our neurodivergent brains go ahead and talk about something for a while. Now, I'm Kent, you may remember me from previous episodes, but I'm not your usual host because we're in Bizarre Land today, and our usual host is the guest. Ooh. Okay, but that's not supposed to be spooky because we're talking about... What are we talking about today?
We are going to be talking about my most long-term love, which is horses, but more specifically, dressage and dressage rule changes that people are either mad or really happy about, depending on who they are. So,
this should be spicy for some people because you have opinions.
I do have opinions. No one else in the world has opinions about this like I do.
You never know. Maybe you'll find somebody on this. Somebody will listen to it and go, yeah, that's what I mean.
Fingers crossed.
So, well, let's just start at the beginning. What is dressage? What is a horse? What is a pony? Actually, the difference between a horse and a pony could be interesting. Could be important.
I would like to think that you all know what a horse is by now. Although, to be fair, so many people that I've spoken to do not know the difference between a horse and a pony. They think that a pony is just a young horse and they will grow eventually, and that is not true. So, a pony differs from a horse. We'll start with that. Because a pony is under 14.2 hands high. Horsey people measure their equines in hands, which is 4 inches. Originally, a hand was just like the side of a man's hand. So, like, if you measure from the bottom of your pinky finger to the top of your index finger, that would be a hand. Back before we had rulers and stuff. But that is about 4 inches, so that is the sort of standardized measure now.
That's much smaller than I thought it would be.
So in like showing and stuff, people are starting to measure in centimeters more. They're starting to go over to the metric system. So sometimes in adverts for ponies, you'll see them measured in centimeters. So you might see a pony listed as 132 centimeters or 148 centimeters. But I don't hold with that nonsense. It is hands or bust to me. If people start listing their ponies in centimeters, I turn around and walk away because I don't know what that means. So we measure in hands and inches. So 14.2 hands is 14 lots of 4 inches and 2 inches added on. Which is about 148 centimeters, which is why that metric system is starting to come into place. But it doesn't match up quite right, which is why it annoys me. So ponies are 14.2 and under. They can be any breed, really, but there are quite a lot of breeds that exclusively produce ponies and quite a lot of breeds that exclusively produce horses. And a horse is just anything that is over 14.2 hands high, so from 14.3 up to, I don't know how tall the biggest horse is. I'm a failure of a horse enthusiast. But the biggest horse I've seen someone ride is over 18 hands. Far taller than I am. So that's how you sort of classify between a horse and a pony. And a donkey is a different species, so... Yeah. Donkeys don't do dressage normally. They're not normally ridden, actually. Their backs aren't. Like, their backs are really strong because they're load-carrying animals, but they're not built the right way to carry a saddle and a person. So the same with zebras. You'll never see someone riding a zebra. I know racing stripes makes people think that they can train a zebra to be a racehorse, but it's just not true, unfortunately.
I was thinking various bizarre 80s semi-fantasy movies where you see scantily clad woman with weapon riding a zebra.
Yeah,
it's like, who does that? What? No, zebras.
Yeah.
Try to kill you if you get close. Come on.
You can't train a zebra because they're wild animals, but also like they're not built in the right way to be ridden. So you will never see someone riding a zebra in real life. So in those movies, that's probably a pony that has been painted to look like a zebra. Fun fact for you there.
Are zebras closer in size to ponies then?
They are all
really thought about
ponies.
That.
They're closer in size to donkeys. They're really small.
Because we have some at the zoo, but I've never really thought about them in terms of how close to an actual horse size they are. And they do seem really small.
They're really small. And I think zebras are a different species again from horses and from donkeys, but I think zebras are more closely related to donkeys than they are to horses.
Really?
And like vice versa, donkeys are closer to zebras than they are to horses. You can interbreed all of these species, so that's how you end up with mules, is crossing a horse or a pony with a donkey. But any of those crossbreeds are infertile. They're hybrids. They're not.
Yeah.
It's not like if you cross different breeds of dog. So they are all very different. This is the sort of stuff you learn in biology. This is nothing new to a lot of people.
For some people, it could be, but...
Yeah. So, culturally, in terms of, like, equestrian sport, I don't know how it is in the States, because I'm not American, but in the UK, a lot of people start, if they're riding as a child, they start to move on to horses when they become a teenager. So it's more of a problem in show jumping than it is in any other discipline, because show jumping, you're allowed to compete in senior competitions from the age of 13, and that's the point at which you are no longer allowed to compete in pony-specific classes unless you're going international, because the international legislation has like different rules. So as like on an international level, all the disciplines, show jumping, dressage, and eventing, you are allowed to compete in pony classes until the age of 16. But the British governing bodies for each discipline have their own sets of rules for within the UK. And British show jumping says that you can start competing in senior competitions on a horse from the age of 13. So a lot of people start to do that because they have more prize money, they have bigger classes, there's more of a chance to move up the levels quicker if you're doing that. So a lot of people start moving on to horses when they turn 13 and start sort of moving upwards. So I was under a lot of pressure when I was looking for my pony to start looking for a horse, because I was 12, about to turn 13, and I was quite tall for my age. So everyone was like, if you buy a pony, you're going to outgrow it. There's no point. You might as well spend your money on a horse, and then you can go up the classes quicker. But I didn't really care about that, and we were looking for a family pony more than anything, because in theory, my mum was in charge, and she wanted to ride as well. So we needed something a little bit chunkier, because my mum's not the lightest person. But we needed something that wasn't huge, because my mum's not particularly tall. So we wanted something that was quite sane and sensible and quite calm, but not something that was really tall. And so we didn't want a horse. And I'd never ridden a horse before. I'd only ever ridden ponies. So we ended up with a 14-2-ish Connemara cross, which is an Irish breed. Her name is Fleur. She is my pride and joy. I love her to pieces. And this is not going to become an episode of me rambling about how brilliant she is.
Talk about your children. Come on.
She is my child. I raised this pony. When we went to look at her, we were told in the advert that she was 6. We showed up at their yard and we were told she's actually rising 5, which means she's about to turn 5. But we thought that if we told people that she was only 4, they wouldn't come and see her. So we lied, basically, which is a great start to a viewing. But she was a really sane, sensible pony. She was very sweet. She went very nicely when we rode her. We took her for a little ride around the village on the roads, and she was very relaxed about it. She didn't spook at anything. So we were sort of like, you know what, this is fine. She was young, but we weren't too fussed about that. When they did the vet check the second time, we were warned by the vet that the vet thought she was younger than the passport said, because this is the other thing. All horses in the UK and Europe have to have a passport. They now also have to be microchipped, and every single microchip has to be registered with a central governing body in the UK. But at the time, that wasn't the case. But every single horse or pony has to have a passport, which has a record of who owns it, who has owned it in the past, if it's microchipped, what the microchip number is, if it has a freeze brand, any markings that it might have. So if your horse is not grey and has like white socks on its legs or white markings on its face, those will all be marked. It's got the vaccination record, any other procedures that the vets have done, that kind of thing. They're really useful documents, and everybody has to have one. It normally also has the date of birth, the person who originally registered the passport, any breeding records that they've got, who the mother and father were, that kind of thing. Fleur's passport has none of that because Fleur's passport is a replacement, which means that someone at some point lost the passport and had to get one reissued. But the person who had the replacement passport ordered had just bought her when they had the replacement passport issued. So a lot of the information is missing because they didn't have the original passport to sort of cross-reference it with. And because they just bought her, they didn't have all the information to begin with. So it's got the microchip number, it's got an approximate date of birth, and it's got like all the names and records of who owned her when. But other than that, it's pretty much blank. And the date that we were given as her date of birth is the 1st of January 2008, which is immediately a raised eyebrow because legally all racehorses in the Northern Hemisphere have a birthday on the 1st of January. And that's a thing for the racing industry, but it has carried over into sort of more general horsey world, in that if there is a horse that you don't know its date of birth, its birthday is automatically the 1st of January. So when you look on My Pony's passport and it says that her date of birth is the 1st of January 2008, you can pretty much assume that A, they don't know when the actual birthday is, and B, that it is probably at some point in 2008, which means she is... So when we bought her, she was somewhere between the ages of 3 and 4. Bear in mind that on the original advert, it said she was turning 6.
Yeah.
So she was suddenly a lot younger than we'd expected. So when I say that she is my child, that is because I did basically raise her. She was very, very young when we bought her, and any training that has been done on her since then is because I did it. She was backed and ridden away, which means she had had a saddle and bridle put on, and she had had someone riding her. But since we got her, everything that we've done to get her to where she is was because of me and my instructor, who put so much time and effort into it. But like, I raised this pony. She is my child, which is quite a funny thing to say if you're not me. But I do love her to pieces. She is my pride and joy. And it always confuses people when I talk about her like she is a human person, because she's not. But I am constantly bemused by her and love her with all of my heart. So anyone who goes around thinking that ace people don't have feelings can come and talk to me about it, because they're wrong. Yeah. So that was a very long tangent about my pony and how much I love her. But anyway,
that's good for personal experience.
Yes.
Now, about showing this pony.
If anyone wants to know about me and my pony. There you go. That's all you're getting. You're not getting an official show name off of me because that is way too easy to track me down because I have a British dressage record.
Okay.
But yeah, so dressage is the discipline that I think the least people know about, but is the most interesting, especially once you start to understand what you're watching. A lot of people will disagree with me. They're allowed to disagree with me. I understand that to people who don't have any interest in horses, watching things like racing or 3-day eventing on the cross-country course especially, where there is an increased risk of people falling in water, is a lot more exciting. But I find dressage very interesting and I find it very beautiful, and to me that is just the discipline that I am part of and that I'm proud to be part of to an extent. So dressage is, because I realize that most people don't actually know what it is, dressage is commonly referred to by people who don't actually really know what they're talking about as the thing where the horses dance. And they're not entirely wrong. Because dressage is, at its core, that is what it's meant to look like. It is meant to seem like the horse and rider are dancing. Especially when you're watching dressage to music, that can be what it sort of comes across as. And that is probably the easiest way to get people into dressage at all, is saying it's like horses dancing. And one of the reasons why I find that of the disciplines it is my sort of preferred sport is that it relies a lot more on having a good relationship with your horse. It's a lot more about harmony and how you and your horse act as a team, rather than a sport like, say, show jumping or the cross-country aspect of 3-day eventing, which are a lot more dangerous and a lot more exciting to the untrained eye, but rely a lot more on you pointing a horse at a jump and hoping you get to the other side. If you are looking at a horse sport on the TV and the horse does not look like it is going particularly fast, and it is in a square arena and it is doing funky looking movements with a rider in a tailcoat, that's dressage. It's very elegant, it's very refined and controlled, and for me that's what works. I like that in my horse discipline. But it's not about controlling the horse, it's about you and the horse working together. So if you're watching someone ride dressage and the horse suddenly starts rearing up or bolting across the arena and they're out of control, that is a sign that that relationship isn't working more than anything, and that the horse is stressed and that the rider hasn't mitigated that. So dressage very much sort of subscribes to this idea that it's always the rider's fault rather than the horse. Whereas I think there are some other disciplines where they kind of fall into this trap of, oh, well, the horse dropped its foot and that's why the pole's down, or oh, the horse just isn't built for this, or oh, the horse just wasn't fast enough. Whereas in reality, one of the first rules that you learn as a rider in a riding school is always that it's never the horse's fault. It's always the rider's fault. And your job as a horse person is to find whatever you were doing wrong and fix it, so that that doesn't happen again. So I have a lot of love for dressage as a discipline because at its core, that's what it's all about. But dressage as an industry has a lot of problems with sticking to that ideology.
Ooh.
Which is where we come into this rule change thing. But that will come a little bit later because we have to talk basics first, you said.
Yes.
We're kind of jumping all over the place because I think I mentioned this at the beginning. I have no notes. This was thrust upon me. But I am always down to talk about horses and dressage, so this is fine.
Okay, well, we know the dancing thing. Yeah, that's the key
Yes.
for dressage. But what else do we need to know about that in particular?
Okay, so dressage, there are some sort of key principles of dressage to sort of start off with. And one of the reasons why, if you watch dressage competitions, especially international ones, teams like the Germans are often considered the team to beat. And the reason why that is because they prescribe specifically to these principles. And one of those is called the scales of training, which is that basically that you build up the strength of the horse as you are building your relationship, and you can't achieve the next sort of stepping stone until you've achieved the first one. So they bring on their horses very slowly, and they have to have perfected one step before they move on to the next one. They're not working on things simultaneously. And in theory, British dressage is meant to be run according to these scales of training too, but you often find that judging does not reflect that. So the first of them is rhythm, which, as you can probably imagine, is to do with things being very even and sort of in time. So the walk should have 4 beats. It should be sort of marching. That's the rhythm. You have your 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Not that fast, but like it's a steady rhythm. It's even and correct. The trot has 2 beats. The legs move in diagonal pairs. And it should stay in a steady rhythm the whole time. The speed should stay the same. And the canter has 3 beats, where you have like one leg that strikes off, and then the rest sort of follow. Which is why sometimes you'll hear people saying that someone's cantering on the wrong leg, is because the leg that they've like struck off on is opposite to the way it should be. But the rhythm basically means that the beat should be the same. The beat should be correct for each pace. It should be regular, and it should be the same speed throughout.
Which is why it's set to music a lot.
Yes. So dressage to music is my favorite thing to do, even though I have not done it very often, because of that. Basically, it's very easy to fit things to your horse's rhythm, and then it helps you to keep that rhythm. But yeah, basically they shouldn't speed up or slow down if they're going around a corner or on a straight line, or later on when they're lengthening and shortening their stride. It should all stay the same speed.
I have a bizarre technical question.
Okay.
How long has this been going on? This is centuries old, right?
A while, yeah. It's one of the oldest Olympic sports, I think.
Yeah, well, because then how did you do this with music before recordings? Was there like a band there that like, hey guys, play this?
So. I think the concept of dressage to music is relatively modern, as in like since the Olympics, I guess. But the idea of dressage as a concept basically dates back as far as we've been riding horses.
Okay.
A lot of the sort of core parts of it date back to cavalry type maneuvers. And like you'll see things like the household cavalry and the Canadian mounted police and stuff doing performances which are basically dressage. But they're doing them in formation, and they're doing them with lots of people, and you might see a quadrille sometimes, which is 4 people. You sometimes see pairs dressage, things like that. Like it's very much got its roots in military sort of stuff. which is why a lot of it is about doing things in a specific order, in a specific place, in a specific way. It's about precision, which is very sort of militaristic. But as a sport, it has deviated a lot from that. So the stuff that you see the household cavalry or the mounted police doing are very, very different to the things you'll see in contemporary, like, competitive dressage. But yeah, so the first of the scales of training is rhythm. So that's the thing that you need to nail down first. When you're doing the very, very earliest dressage tests, that is the thing that they will focus on the most in theory, is that your rhythm is correct and regular. And beyond that, like, it shouldn't matter to a degree where the horse's head is, what, like, how bendy it is, whether it's going in a straight line, any of that. What matters is that the rhythm is good. But after that does come suppleness, which is sort of the next sort of key point, because you don't want to have a horse that is really stiff. You want to have a horse that's quite bendy and is loose and doesn't sort of heighten itself when you ask it to do something. So you want to see a horse that is bending on a circle, or we do a thing called a free walk, which is where you loosen the reins a lot in the walk. And if a horse is very supple, the horse will stretch forward and down toward, like, its head will go towards the ground. It won't sort of tuck itself up and back with its head towards its chest. It will go down, but it will go forwards as it's doing it, which is quite a good test of whether it's supple or not. It won't hollow its back out. It'll start stretching. And we like to see that in a horse, and we like to see that quite early on, because that means it's not fighting you. That means your horse is working with you and that it's happy and loose. And yeah, so suppleness is good, and that's the next thing after rhythm. You can't have suppleness without a good rhythm. And if your rhythm is bad, then your suppleness is normally also bad. So that's sort of the next thing that they start to look for. I always get pulled up on suppleness because my pony is very short-backed. Her conformation, the way she's built, isn't that great. So she finds it really, really hard to bend well. She can bend on a circle and on corners and things, but she struggles with stretching specifically. And it's something that we're working really hard on, and she is getting a lot better at it over time, but it is something that she is always going to struggle with. So yeah, so we always get pulled up on that, and we are aware of it and we work on it because that is what we do. But if she's not supple and if she is tight and her muscles aren't working properly, then that's bad for her physically. They can't perform the higher level movements that they need to do at certain levels if they're not supple. So you really cannot skip any of these steps, is the thing. You have to have each successive one to get to the next one. And without any one of those, the whole thing just sort of falls apart. So those are sort of the first two. And these are the kinds of things that they look for at sort of the very early levels. I don't know how much people know about British sort of dressage levels, and like specifically because they differ a lot from things like in the States and in mainland Europe and stuff. But in the UK we have introductory, which is just walk and trot, and then we have preliminary, novice, elementary, medium, advanced medium, etc., etc., and it goes all the way up to Grand Prix, which is the stuff you see on TV. And we ride mostly at novice and elementary, but she can do movements at sort of medium level, but we don't compete at that level because she hasn't got some of the other things that she needs lower down, like solidified. So trying to compete her at a higher level would mostly just result in a decrease in not just score, but like decrease in her happiness and our sort of good relationships. And that's what's more important. We want her to be happy and we want her to be safe. And trying to force her to ride movements that she's not really ready for just because she can would not be sort of good. She's very good at things like lateral work, which is where they go sideways. And the more sort of collected, in air quotes, movements, but she's not very good at stretching. So that's the most important thing for us at the moment, is working on that. So the next thing after suppleness is contact, which is about sort of the feel through the reins. So you should be able to, when you're holding the reins in your hands, you should be able to feel the horse's mouth at the end of the reins. But it shouldn't be really like strong. You shouldn't be clinging onto the horse's mouth, so to speak. You should be able to feel it, because that's what you use to steer, and like stop.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't be clinging onto it for dear life. You should be riding mostly with your legs and your seat. So contact should come from the hind legs, mostly. And this sort of links into the next of the scales of training, which is impulsion. But if they're working correctly, all that energy should be traveling over the back and over the neck, which causes them to go into a sort of a rounder shape. I realize this sounds very abstract if you can't see pictures and videos. Yeah. But basically the especially in the trot and the canter, it should feel quite springy, and the neck should sort of naturally arch, rather than sort of you tugging your hands back and forth to force a pretty looking neck. You know, it should all come naturally. You need to have some kind of contact on the reins for that to happen, because if you're not holding onto the reins at all, if you've got a very loose contact, even if they're working really well over like from behind and over the back, the contact won't be there. They won't know where to go. They won't know which way to bend. They won't know if you ask them to stop. So you should be able to feel their mouth through the reins. That means there's a connection there, but you shouldn't be pulling them in, and you shouldn't be just letting them go completely, basically, is what we get from that. And that does link into the next one, which is impulsion. I do think to a degree that you need the impulsion almost before you can have the contact. And this is, again, something that we're working on quite a lot with my pony, because that's about the power of the horse. That's about it working from its hindquarters, from its hind legs. It's about the energy that it has. It's not about speed. It's about the sort of the bounce. It shouldn't go faster just because you've put your legs on. It should just rise up a bit, I guess. It should be springy. It should be bouncy. It should have a lot of energy to the steps. And there shouldn't be really any resistance, I guess. But some horses naturally have a lot of impulsion, a lot of bounce. And they can be quite hard to control because of it. See, doing dressage on the TV, you watch the riders and they're not moving in the saddle. They're sitting super duper still. They're not moving. They're not bouncing. You see their legs move because that's how you ask the horse to do things, but they're tiny, tiny movements, and their bodies aren't moving. They're staying very upright. They're staying very still, and that's a massive display of how strong those riders are. because the horses that you see on TV are exactly the kind of horse that I could not ride because they are too bouncy. They have too much impulsion. The really athletic, the very athletic horses are the ones that have the most impulsion naturally. But part of what dressage is all about is about sort of reining that in to a level that works for the horse and for the rider. So the rider has to allow the horse to... Yes, so the rider has to allow the horse to show off how fantastic it is and how much impulsion it has without it getting to the point where the rider can't handle it. And to an extent, often the horse knows exactly what the rider can and can't take, especially when you've got that kind of really close relationship that a lot of these riders do have with their horses. So like, I know that when I'm riding my pony, if I'm riding with stirrups, she's a lot bouncier and a lot more forward and like active than she is if I'm riding with no stirrups, because if I'm riding with no stirrups, as much as I work very hard to be like a strong and athletic rider, like physically, I know, and she knows because we've worked together so much, that I am not physically strong enough to hold myself in a good center of balance if she goes the same when I'm riding without stirrups. Like if she went in exactly the same way with the same amount of energy and the same amount of bounce, I would be off balance, and then that would impact on her anyway. They can't do the kinds of things that they need to do if they're not in balance, and they're not in balance if you as a rider are not in balance. So it's something that both of you can cope with, because some horses have so much impulsion and so much energy that trying to contain that power blows their brains. They can't handle it, and that's when you start to see them being idiots, basically. That's when you start seeing them spinning around and leaping up in the air because they've got so much energy and they don't know what to do with it, and the rider's saying, no, you can't go any faster because I can't cope with it. And they're like, but I've got all this energy inside me, and they don't know what to do with it, so they just explode. Which is unfortunate, but it happens. And it's happened to me sometimes. You go to a show and the pony's just like, I've got loads of energy today, mum, and I don't know what to do with it. And this isn't engaging me properly, so I'm going to start bucking. And it happens to everyone. But a lot of these horses that you see at the very high level shows, I think the people that you see on TV, those horses are very hot horses. They have a lot of energy to begin with. They're very... they're bred that way. They have a lot of normally like thoroughbred or Arab blood in them, and they have it. They have energy in spades. But yeah, so once you've got all of those things, then the next thing that you need to work on is straightness, which is ironic because you are asked to ride straight lines from day one.
Yeah.
But it's actually one of the last things that you actually need to work on, because it's more important to have the rhythm established, to have the suppleness established, because if you are constantly riding straight lines and working on your straightness constantly, then they don't develop properly. Like, their muscles don't develop very well. But what's interesting is that horses, just like us, are one-sided, right? Like, we are right or left-handed, and horses are exactly the same. They work better one way than another. So I know that Fleur quite often works better on the right rein when she's turning to the right than when she's turning to the left. The exclusive difference to this is when we're doing our lateral work, when we're going sideways. But for the most part, she goes a lot better when she's going to the right than to the left. Just like us, horses are very one-sided. And if you as a rider don't also watch how you are sitting and how your weight is is sitting and how you're holding onto your reins, because quite often if you're right-handed, for example, your hold on the right rein will be stronger than your hold on the left rein. If you don't watch your own crookedness, then that one-sidedness in the horse will get worse. And if your horse starts to become crooked in that way, then it is much more difficult for them to maintain their balance and to have that impulsion that they need and all of the things that come before. So you need to work on all of the things that come before in order for your horse to be straight, and vice versa. Your horse needs to be straight in order to achieve all those other things. So the idea is that the hind legs step into the hoof prints of the front legs on a straight line and on a circle, regardless of what you're doing. The horse's hind legs should stay exactly in line with the relevant front leg. So the left hind leg should stay in line with the left front leg.
Not exactly in the same spot.
No,
but
not exactly.
on the same line.
But on the same line. Sometimes you'll see differences in this. So, for example, when you're doing movements that involve going sideways, so things like shoulder in or quarter in, where it's pretty self-explanatory. Shoulder in, the shoulders are off the fence, and they're riding in a straight line, but the horse's body is angled. You are riding on what's called 3 tracks, where one front leg is on a completely separate line from the other front leg. And so in that situation, the left hind leg matches up with where the right front leg is, rather than the other way around. But those are sort of pretty unique differences. For the most part, the hind legs should be exactly in the same line as the relevant front leg. And that's, like, straightness is the kind of thing that sounds really simple, right? Like, you're just riding a straight line. It sounds like it should be really easy, but it's a lot harder when, for example, you don't have the fence right next to you. If you are trying to ride a straight line down the middle of an arena with absolutely no guidelines, it's actually very hard to stay on track for that straight line. And it's something that, quite ironically, I've gotten worse at riding since I started riding in my glasses.
I can almost see that.
When I was much younger, I used to ride without my glasses on, and it wasn't that my vision was not that bad. I couldn't see a thing. Dressage is ridden in an arena with letter markers, so you have to ride certain movements at certain markers. And when you first enter an arena, you go down the very center of the arena in a straight line. So it's that situation where you're riding down the middle of an arena with absolutely no guidelines on either side, and you are aiming for one letter. And that letter is written on a white, in black font, on a white piece of plastic about the size of an A4 piece of paper, if you're lucky. And I couldn't read them.
At a distance of...
probably
of 100 yards.
Between 40 to 60 meters, depending on what arena you're in. So the shortest arenas that we ride in are 20 meters by 40 meters, and the long ones that you ride in for affiliated dressage, which is what I'm doing at the moment, they're 20 by 60 normally.
That's still a long distance.
So it's still it's quite a long distance to be looking at a very, very small marker. And I couldn't read the letters, so I had to memorize where all the letters were in the arena. I learned a mnemonic to remember where all the letters were. But the thing is that different sized arenas have different markers in.
Right.
So a 20 by 40 arena has A, K, E, H, C, M, B, and F. But a 20 by 60 arena has 4 extra markers. And this does not include the sort of intermediary markers in the middle of the arena that have no letter. Like they have a letter attached to that point, but there's no like visible marker for it. You just have to remember that it's there. So when you halt at the end of a test, if it's right in the middle of the arena, that's called X. But there's no visible marker for that. You just have to remember that X is the direct middle of the arena. But yeah, so I used to ride without my glasses on, and I would go into this dressage test, and I would enter the arena at A, and I would ride towards C, and the judges sit to C. And you have to halt in the middle and salute, and then ride off again. So I would enter at A, and I couldn't see the marker. So I would ride directly for where the judges were sitting, and hope that that was where the marker was.
Hope it's not to the left or the right, or
Yeah,
that they're sitting right behind it. Yeah.
But it worked 90% of the time. And there was one point when I was about 15, maybe, where hands down the worst dressage test I'd ever written in my life. But I got a 9. So dressage movements are marked out of 10. I was given a 9 for a centre line because it was that straight.
Okay.
Hands down, the best movement I've ever ridden in my life. I have never been given a 9 for anything before or since. But yeah, it's a really hard movement to ride because you have no guidelines to help you. It is just you and the horse in the middle of a flat surface riding towards one specific point. And it's very easy to start drifting to one side or another, or the horse bends its neck slightly, or you sit down at an angle and your weight distribution is wrong, and then you start moving to one side, and to not even notice you're doing it until you get to the other end of the arena, and suddenly you're 2 meters to the left of where you need to be. So it's very easy to not be straight and not notice. But yeah, so the very last of the scales of training is collection. And this is where it gets very difficult to explain and also highly contentious.
Is this where the rules change was?
Sort of.
Okay.
So collection is the easiest way to explain it, I think, is that it's a combination of contact, which we talked about earlier, and impulsion. Because if a horse has impulsion, it is using its hind legs like that motor, like that engine, to drive itself forward, and it is driving itself forward into your rein contact. So the reins control the stopping. Pulling on the reins is always a stopping motion. Okay. But it is driving itself forward into your hand. So the collection is sort of the culmination of every single one of those scales of training. If a horse is straight, if it has a good rhythm, if it has impulsion and contact and balance and all of the other things that it needs, then it will collect. So when you watch the horses on TV, a lot of the time they will be very, very collected for the majority of the movements, and it's a shortening of the stride and a lightening of the front part of their body. So a lot of the time, if you look very closely at snapshots of them, their hind quarters, their bum, will be lower than their shoulders because they are so much driving from behind and so much contact in the front that it's physically lifting the front part of their body. And it gives them more freedom to move the shoulders and to have more impulsion, and they carry themselves forward using their hind legs. So in the lower levels, the intro, the prelims, the novices, they don't ask for any collection. But there are movements included that are designed to start to develop the skills that the horse and the rider needs to achieve it later on. So especially sort of from novice tests upwards, there's a lot of lengthening and shortening of the horse's strides. You sort of sometimes start to build in some sideways movement. You might start to do rein back, which is where they move backwards. And those are all those movements all sort of build towards this collection. So when you see a horse doing Grand Prix, the highest level of dressage, when you see them trotting on the spot or turning in a circle in a canter pirouette, that's the highest level of collection that you can achieve as a partnership. And that's why those movements are only included in that level. Because if you start trying for those movements when you're not ready for them, you're going to hurt yourself and your horse. It's not something that is easy, and it's not something that can be achieved quickly. You have to build up all these other things in order to get there. But the reason why it's quite contentious, not as a scale of training, like it's something that everyone builds to, but the reason why collection has become a sort of buzzword, I guess, within the dressage community is because when it's especially a problem when you're watching people on TV and don't know quite what's going on behind the scenes, it quite often you will see people riding and the horse is very sort of tucked in and sort of curled in on itself and looks very tense. And that is when collection has gone wrong. Because that means that normally that they don't have the suppleness, which is one of the very earliest stages of training. And it comes across as the horse looking very tense and upset and pissed off. And it's just a not ideal situation for anyone to be in, I guess. But there was a period of time, I was about to say not that long ago, but we're talking like the 2010s. So about 10 years ago now.
That was 2 hours ago.
I know, right? Where there was a sort of a training concept, I guess, that became very popular in particularly sort of higher level dressage called Rollkur. And it was, I don't know who came up with it. It sounds like a German word, but I don't think it was actually a German concept. It was something that the Dutch team practiced a lot, where they would overuse the contact to the exclusion of the other stages of training. So their collection became the horse going with its chin tucked into its chest and the reins so tight that it couldn't bend, really. It was incredibly ugly to watch. The horses weren't happy. No one was particularly happy about it, really. But because the Dutch at the time were considered the best in the world, the judging reflected that, it became a very sort of fashionable way to ride, where the sort of the outline that you wanted as a dressage rider became having the horse's head tucked inwards and very curled over. Often to the point where people were ignoring things like impulsion or suppleness, and it was all about where the horse's head was, basically. And if you didn't have your horse's head tucked in, then you were doing dressage wrong, which is unfortunate because that's not what the rules say. And by and large, that is now becoming unfashionable again, which is good. And part of the reason for that was because a lot of very high-profile vets and sort of equine science researchers published a lot of papers that proved that it was very, very bad for the horses physically. It causes a lot of damage to the vertebrae in their neck, especially where it joins onto like the ears, because obviously they're curled right over. It can cause damage to their tongue and their jaw. It causes them a lot of stress, so they can end up with stomach ulcers, which horses are prone to anyway. We'll do another episode at some point that is just me talking about horse evolution, because they're a disaster. But basically, this way of riding that these people had developed that was becoming very like the in thing. This was how people who were very famous were riding their horses and were advocating for as like the next stage of dressage, and it was actually harming the horses they were riding. But sports like dressage move very slowly. So while all these articles were being published and read and listened to, the powers that be and the people at the top of the sport weren't necessarily listening very quickly. And it's very hard to sort of untrain these kinds of things. So sometimes if you look quite deeply into sort of historic dressage type things, you might hear about a horse called Totolas, who is a Dutch horse, a very, very famous Dutch dressage horse from around the time when I was first sort of getting into dressage. Is a little bit before my time in terms of like when I started competing, but he remained a very a very visual figure in the community because he had won so many medals. Him and Edward Gull, who's a Dutch rider, they'd won so many medals together. They'd been on so many gold medal winning teams. They'd competed all over the world. This was sort of 2000 to 2010, 2012-ish. Yeah. They were the figures of dressage, and they got caught up in this roll cur thing. And eventually Totolas got sold to another Dutch rider. This happens all the time in dressage. I'll complain about it a little bit later on, but he got sold from Edward Gull, who loved this horse to pieces and was one of the first who had practiced roll cur to turn around and say, actually, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. The research says it's not good. So Totolas got sold to another rider, and it was all downhill from there. And I believe he died last year or the year before from, I want to say, colic caused by ulcers, which is probably a result of all this stress. And the rider that he was sold to continued to practice roll cur, and they never got the scores that this horse had got with Edward Gull. They never managed to replicate any of the achievements that he'd achieved before. Edward Gull and Totolas held the world record for Grand Prix and Grand Prix Freestyle, which is dressage to music, until 2012. So they were the best of the best. And yeah, it's just sort of a story of how the mighty have fallen, I guess, when this sort of came to center stage and when it became very popular. The people got drawn in by it, but it wasn't a thing that was good for them, and it wasn't a thing that was good for the sport, and it became quite ugly, I guess, in terms of like social movements, because you had a lot of infighting over what was best and should the rules change, and people saying this needs to stop, you're not changing things fast enough, there's not been enough like outcry against this, all this sort of not activist stuff, because it's not a big enough thing for that, but but sort of people speaking out against it and saying you're not doing anything. And it became sort of a bit of a black spot in the record of dressage as a sport, because it sort of breached containment and people outside of dressage got hold of the fact that this was happening. So organizations like PETA and the RSPCA and stuff got hold of it, and that got very ugly very quickly, and we should stop riding horses entirely because it's cruel, and look at all this stuff that the dressage riders are doing, and blah 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 blah. And yeah, so it got to the point where it's becoming very sort of, it was bad publicity to be someone who enjoys dressage. But that sort of changed, especially in the UK, around the time that the London Olympics happened,
Right.
for entirely separate reasons. But it was the whole rollkur thing was sort of a bastardization of what collection means. So in the original sort of but in the dressage like rule book, the ideal standard for what the general picture should look like is that the rider should look like they are not doing anything. They should be very still, very serene, and the horse should look like they're doing everything of their own free will. The general shape should be that the horse's neck is arched but not like curled over, and that the horse's nose should be in front of its ears. I don't know if you can visualize this in your head. But that like the nose should be pointing downwards, but that it should be slightly sort of, it shouldn't be a straight vertical line downwards. The nose should be poking out a little bit. And that was sort of seen as the ideal picture for a long time. The horse should be working from behind. It should have that sort of that lift at the front, but the neck shouldn't be tight. And I think when people started realizing that this whole rollkur thing was A, dangerous for the horse, and B, completely against the sort of the founding principles of dressage and against what the rulebook said the ideal picture should be, that was when it started to sort of change a little bit and people started to move away from it. But it's still the sort of thing where people look at it now and go, that should never have happened. That should never have been a thing. So it is still sort of quite contentious. When people talk about collection, different people at different levels of dressage have different opinions on what it means and what it looks like in a horse. And to some people, collection still looks like rollkur. So they, depending on their stance on it, they will say that collection automatically is a bad thing, or that today's horses are not collected enough and they need to go back to that sort of image of the neck being very curled over and the nose being very close to the chest. But it's still something that a lot of people argue about, and it's something that comes up again in these rule changes later on. So I guess we'll talk more about that later.
We know
Yes.
the rules now.
You know,
We
these aren't even rules. These are just like the founding
how it
principles,
happens.
I guess.
Yeah.
Like when I first started doing affiliated dressage, which I realize means absolutely nothing to you, I read the British Dressage rulebook cover to cover. So I do have a slightly encyclopedic knowledge of British Dressage rules circa 2013. But they've changed now, so I no longer have an encyclopedic knowledge of up-to-date British Dressage rules, unfortunately. But 13-year-old me,
Yes.
14-year-old me, that sort of
Much
age,
different.
I knew all the rules. I knew everything. But yeah, so that's sort of where dressage comes from. Those are sort of the stepping stones that you have to sort of jump between to get up the levels. You start with the rhythm and you work up to the collection. You don't start from collection and then fix everything else along the way.
And this
If
obviously
you,
takes years.
yeah, it does.
mean-
It can take over a decade. Like, we've had Fleur for 10 years and we are still not there.
Yeah, and she's anywhere from 13 to 16 years old.
It's a constant work in progress. And this is the thing, is there is no upper limit to where you can go and what you can do. Even the people who go to the Olympics and win the gold medals and break the world records and do every single movement seemingly perfectly, they still have things to work on. So the current Olympic gold medalist is Jessica von Bredel-Werdel. She's German. She got over 90% at the last Olympics. And I follow her on Instagram, and she still constantly is posting about how I'm still training, I'm still working really hard on how to make myself better, on how to develop my relationship with my horse, how to work on, it's like tiny minutiae of the things that they're doing, and she's constantly working to improve and get better, because even though she's scoring over 90% when she goes out, that's not perfect. There's still more that she can do. There's still more ways that she can make things more difficult.
Because when we think of a lot of Olympic events, like let's say gymnastics, it's like, oh, they scored what effectively would be 99% or 98% or some high percentage. And you're saying 90 is Olympic level. It's Olympic champion level.
Yeah.
That's nuts that there's still all that room there.
Yeah, there's loads of room to constantly get better. One of my big complaints with lower level dressage is that either the judging is much harsher or there is less room to make mistakes. Because in the lower levels, it is very, very rare to see people get over 75% in any class or any competition. So I think the highest score I have ever been given is about 76%, and that was incredibly unusual. When you do a dressage test, you have all the movements written out, and then you have boxes next to them, and the judges write their scores and their comments in them. And you get that sheet back at the end of the test. And this is part of the reason why I like dressage more than I like show jumping or cross country or anything like that, because you get, like, you pay money to enter this class, and A, it's not all based on luck. B, you also get told what you need to do to get better. You get actual value for money. But quite often you'll get sort of in the high 60s, and there'll be hardly any comments written on your sheet. And the judge will have given you like a 7 maybe for a movement, and they're just like, it was very good. But they won't tell you how to improve. And it's like, if there's no way for me to improve on that movement, then why is it a 7 and not a 10? Or like at least an 8, you know? So that's sort of a complaint that I and a lot of people have with sort of the lower levels, is that you watch people compete at the lower levels, and then you watch people compete at the at Grand Prix or Prix St. George, which is like the next level down, I think. And they seem to get much, much higher scores, regardless of whether they make mistakes or not. Like, the lowest scores at the Olympics were about the same as the highest scores in a novice class. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, why can I not get that percentage when I am making less mistakes?
Is it political or?
I don't know. No one seems to know the answer. I have asked this to several people, and no one seems to have an answer for me. But it's the same with like when you do an essay, right? You submit your essay, and the teacher
Yeah.
gives you a score, and they don't actually give you much feedback, and you're like, well, why is this a 2-1 and not a first when all you've written on it was I liked it? Like, what does that mean? How do I make it better? But yeah, so there's always room for improvement. There's always things that you can do to get better. Like even the people at the top, they're constantly working harder, and especially when it comes to things like the freestyle tests, the dressage to music, they're not like pre-written tests. You design those floor plans yourself. And some of the scores that come out of those specifically are based on like artistry and difficulty, a little bit like gymnastics when you're watching like the floor or the beams or whatever. You get marked on how difficult it is and how pretty it is and like how it all flows together. So one of the things that the top riders will sometimes work on is how to make that floor plan more difficult, but maintain that degree of artistry and maintain the level that they were riding at and how well the horse goes, so they don't lose out on what they already had, but they make that difficulty score even higher. So there's always things that you can do to improve, whereas I think I keep comparing it to show jumping in a negative way. I don't hate show jumpers. I think that all horse sports are good. I love horses. I love watching horses. It's great. I love it. My only discipline that I despise on a fundamental level is racing, but that's mostly because I don't like the racing industry. But I will keep negatively comparing show jumping to dressage because I have been burned by show jumping before. But I think show jumping is like once you get to a certain level, there's nothing you can really do to improve because it's mostly luck. The pole either stays up or it falls down. And a lot of the time it can just be as simple as you brushed it with a hoof and it fell down, and the person who went after you brushed the same jump with the same hoof at the same angle, but it stayed up. And there's nothing you can really do about that. Yes. Like the wind hit it and it blew down or something like that. Like there's not a whole lot you can really do at a certain point. Like the jumps don't get any higher. Whereas dressage, there are constantly things that you can be doing to improve yourself and your horse and your relationship with your horse and how it all works. So I will big up dressage until the cows come home. Basically, it's my thing. I am not a salesperson for dressage. I don't work for British Dressage, but if they wanted to hire me to be a spokesperson for dressage as a sport, I would do it in a heartbeat. I love it very much. But yeah, it's one of those things where like once you have a fundamental understanding of what it's supposed to look like, it becomes very interesting to watch because different people ride in different ways and they prefer different styles of horses and they do things in a slightly different way. So it becomes very interesting to watch, and especially with the freestyle to music, because you get people riding to different styles of music. And I think that sort of all came to a head, especially in the UK in 2012, because that was when we had the London Olympics. So it was at home. But London 2012 was very special in terms of dressage because it was the first time the British team had won a team dressage medal in a while. Until that point, it had been all about the Germans and all about the Dutch. And the British never really got a look in. We had a couple of sort of stalwart competitors. So we had people like Carl Hester, who I am like 7 degrees of separation from via my instructor. And people like Gareth Hughes and Richard Davidson, who are also sort of very sort of traditional British dressage names. But London 2012 we won a gold medal in the team competition, which was unusual because we hadn't done that for ages. We hadn't done that basically ever. And that was very exciting for a start. But the team medal doesn't include the freestyle to music. When you ride at the Olympics, the team competition is the Grand Prix, which is the first day of competition, and the Grand Prix Special, which is the first stage of the individual competition and the second stage of the team competition, like a combined event. That's the second day. So we won a gold medal in the team competition, which was 2 days or 2 classes. And that was the first time we'd won a gold medal in dressage in basically forever. Like, not forever, but for a while. So that was quite a big deal to begin with, but people weren't really aware that it was happening because horse sports weren't a thing that were really shown on TV or talked about, because they're still seen as quite elitist, and people don't really get involved in them. Like you see the racing on the TV, and we have a couple of really big 3-day events, which for people who don't know anything about that, that's they have a day of dressage, a day of cross country, which is galloping like on a racetrack, but with really big solid fences like logs and ditches, and then a day of show jumping, and the person who does the best across all 3 events wins. That's sort of the modern setup for that. So we will get quite a lot of 3-day eventing shown on the TV, because we have the big 4-star competitions at Burley House and Badminton in the spring and in the autumn. So those get shown on TV, but dressage doesn't. It wasn't something that people knew existed. So we'd won this gold medal in the team competition, and we were doing pretty well coming into the last part of the individual competition. All 4 members of the dressage team had qualified as individuals for the dressage to music day, which outside of like the top 3 teams is almost unheard of. There are very limited spots in that final day of competition. So for the most part, you get the people from the top 3 teams and then selected other people from the next sort of 5 or 6 teams who have done particularly well for themselves. It's quite rare to have a team come out of nowhere and like wipe the floor with everyone. But we were doing it. We'd done very well in the team competition, and everyone had gotten through to the individual. And that was, I think, when the BBC realised we have to show this.
Yeah.
So they
you're
changed.
Not getting many other gold medals. Oh,
no. So they changed their scheduling. They put it on. It was meant to be on. The BBC's like sports scheduling is weird when there's an Olympics.
Yeah.
It was meant to be on BBC Sport, which is their online showing, and on the Red Button as part of like a drop-down menu of different things you could watch on the Red Button. But they changed their scheduling for it because they were expecting us to do very well suddenly, and they changed it to BBC One, which is the main channel, the one that everyone watches. But they didn't show all of it on BBC One. They just showed like sort of the end part of it where all of the British riders were. So the first half of it was on the Red Button like normal, and then they switched to BBC One, and there was a little pop-up that's just like, we're switching to BBC One, go watch it there instead. And I remember seeing that come up and going, oh, this is going to be interesting. So we switched to BBC One, and it was amazing. And I think that was the moment where a lot of, especially young people, got into dressage. Like that was definitely one of the sort of the defining moments for me, where I sort of went, this is the sport that I want to be a part of. My mum cried. It was a sport that people think is boring, right? Like nobody wants to watch it normally. And especially like occasionally you'll see like the Grand Prix dressage from the London International Horse Show come on very late at night in December, because that's when that show is on. And it's on like the red button, or they might show highlights on BBC Two, and people are like, oh, it's the horses again. But watching it at 2012 when it was at home and it was the British team was just something else. So our team that year, the main three, because only 3 scores counted towards the team score, were Carl Hester, who 7 degrees of separation, Laura Beckelsheimer, who is now called Laura Tomlinson, because she got married, and Charlotte Dujardin, who is a name that she's probably the most famous name in dressage now. So of those 3, we ended up with a team gold, an individual bronze, and an individual gold. Ooh. We basically swept the board. So Laura Beckelsheimer won the bronze. She rode a big chestnut horse who I remain obsessed with, and she rode him to a medley of The Lion King, which was just such fun to watch. I love it. But Charlotte Dujardin, this was the test where she'd broken the world record in the Grand Prix special class the previous day. So everyone knew that she was going to be the one to watch. And she came in and rode this freestyle to music to a compilation of very traditional British songs. So she was doing canter pirouettes to the chimes of Big Ben. And like using like James Bond music and Austin Powers and all of that kind of thing. Like, not the national anthem, but like, all those sort of songs that you hear repeated at like huge patriotic events, like the Jubilee celebrations and all of that. There was not Rule Britannia, as far as I am aware, but it was that kind of theme, and she was riding to this very patriotic British music at London 2012 and broke the world record for the freestyle to music. And I can't remember off the top of my head what score she got, but it was well over 90%. I've got 96 in my head, but I can't remember if that was the freestyle to music or the Grand Prix special, but it was definitely around that score. So she quite literally smashed it out of the water. But the reason why that was such a big deal was because she was very young, and her first ever Grand Prix dressage test was earlier that year. So she was the least experienced rider on the team, riding the least experienced horse.
How did she even get on the team then?
Her instructor was Carl Hester, who is basically the grandfather of British dressage. but also she was just that good.
Yeah.
She was amazing. And I think seeing that on BBC One at about 2:00 in the afternoon in the middle of the summer holidays, when everyone's at home and watching the Olympics, it was like this massive moment where the sport suddenly became relevant again. And since then, it's kind of sort of dropped off the map again. But that was a moment where the tide started changing on horse sports generally. We had a very good year that year. We have not quite replicated it since. Because that was the year we also won a silver medal in the eventing, and we had not won an eventing medal for about 15 years. And we got like team gold in the show jumping or something. Charlotte Dujardin and Vallegro were the combination that sort of embodied what it meant to do dressage. They very clearly were on the same wavelength constantly. The horse was having a fantastic time. She was grinning constantly. She barely had to move in the saddle to get him to do what she wanted him to do. It was beautiful to watch. And you very rarely see that kind of relationship. So we have gotten to 2012.
Yes.
So we are getting there slowly. But so the rule change thing. We'll start with the British dressage rules, actually, because this is the nice one. This is the one that I like. So keeping to our podcast title. Hey, I like changes to the British dressage rules this year. So because I started doing British dressage again this year, I took a break for a couple of years because of uni and a couple of other things. Yeah, so I recently started doing British dressage again, which meant I got a nice shiny new copy of the rules.
Okay.
Because when you pay up to become a member, you get a nice shiny badge and you get a member pack that includes your badge, and it includes a little card with your membership number on, one for you and one for your horse because you are separate entities.
That lets you charge separate.
And you get a member's handbook which has all the rules in. And I was looking through it before we went to our first show of the year, just to see if anything in particular had changed that I needed to be aware of. I am the kind of person who reads rulebooks cover to cover. I have not memorized this one, so I don't know all the rules. But what I thought was quite interesting was that they have changed their rules so that once you get to sort of the higher levels, spurs and double bridles are no longer compulsory. So spurs are the little, like the metal that goes on the back of the rider's boot. In dressage, they're very small. They're very blunt. They're not, like, sometimes you'll see Western riders wearing these really huge ones with like wheels on the end with spikes. Dressage spurs don't look like that. They're tiny. They're not designed to hurt the horse. They're designed to just back up your leg aids a little bit and help you to be more precise with your aids. But I don't ride in them because I am scared of them. My personal choice is that I don't wear them. And double bridles are another thing that you mostly see in very, very high level dressage, where you have two bits in the horse's mouth and two sets of reins, which again is designed to help you be more precise with your aids and sort of back up your aids a little bit more because you're doing more complicated stuff, so you need that level of precision. And also just because they look fancier. Honestly, a lot of dressage is about aesthetics. This is why you see the top riders wearing tailcoats. They don't need tailcoats. They just look fancy. You should have heard all the drama that was happening about the helmet rules. My God. Anyway, so double bridles have two bits in the horse's mouth and two sets of reins. One of the bits is a snaffle bit, and one of them is normally a snaffle bit is the mildest sort of bit that you will use. So a double bridle has a bit a little bit like that, something that's very mild and very soft. And a pelham, which is a stronger bit, but only if you use it in a certain way. And it has a what's called a curb chain that goes under their chin. And the reins are like dropped further down, so it's meant to give you sort of more leverage over their mouth. But they're because there's two bits and because there's two reins, they're quite fiddly and complicated to use, and it can be really nasty if they're not used properly. And they're a lot stronger than anyone really needs. But a lot of dressage riders will swear by them because they make their aids more precise, and that's what they feel they need. And fair dues. If you need it, then you whatever. Sure, use what you need to have the best working relationship with your horse. But I have never used one on Fleur. I've never felt the need to use one on Fleur because I'm not riding at that sort of level. So the most recent change in the British dressage rulebook is to make spurs and double bridles no longer compulsory beyond a certain level. And I'll talk about spurs particularly because spurs are the thing that I was most concerned about. I've never used a double bridle nor felt the need to use a double bridle, and I know full well that I'm never going to get to the sort of level where it was compulsory to use one. So, but the spurs rules I found quite interesting because previously my old rulebook from 2014 had said that it was compulsory to wear spurs, not to use them necessarily, but to wear them.
Wear them.
If you were riding at medium level or above. And obviously I ride novice and elementary at the moment, which is only one level below medium. So if I had wanted to move up, I would have had to have worn spurs. And obviously I'm nowhere near moving up, so it doesn't matter. But that was very concerning for me. And it was sort of a mental sort of cap on how high I could go within dressage, because in the back of my mind always was this knowledge that if I progress too far, I will have to start riding in spurs. And I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
The fact that that's now changed and you no longer have to use them, I think is a lot better for the sport. It doesn't mean that there's going to be any sort of visible change at the higher levels. It doesn't mean that anyone who is currently using spurs is going to have to stop using them. It just means that if you don't want to use them, you don't have to, which I think is nice. The other rule changes that are less recent, because these are obviously for starting in January of this year, so
okay.
These are like the most recent rule changes. But the other more recent ones that have been put in sort of across the board as of the late 2010s ish, I think it was just before Rio, sort of in response to this roll curve thing, was a blood ban. And why this didn't exist before, I don't know. But basically the rule that they made, this wasn't just British dressage, this was all dressage governing bodies across the world, including the FEI, which is global organization for equestrian sports. They're the ones who organize like equestrian sports at the Olympics and everything. They made this rule where if a judge sees blood anywhere on the horse, whether that's it's cut its leg when it's trotting, whether that's the rider has dug its spurs in too much and there's blood on the horse's side, whether that's mostly what this applied to was this roll curve thing where they're pulling on the horse's mouth. If there was blood on the horse's mouth especially, you get eliminated straight away. There's no appeal. You can't argue about it. You get eliminated because it's a welfare issue. If the horse has blood on it, then there's something wrong. Whether that's with how you're riding or whether that's the horse has like kicked itself, there is something wrong and the horse needs veterinary attention at the very least. So if the judge sees blood, you get pulled up and you're eliminated. And that was a relatively new thing at the time. No one had really considered that happening before. And to a lot of people, it came out of nowhere.
That seems
and they were very surprised by it, which a lot of people were surprised it wasn't already a rule. Dressage made this rule change where any sign of blood results in elimination, and it has resulted in people getting eliminated over the years. Like I was at Olympia, the London International Horse Show, a few years ago, just to watch. I'm not that good.
Yeah.
Watching the dressage to music, and there was a Danish rider who got eliminated after her very first centre line. So she'd just come in to the arena and she got eliminated because there was blood in the horse's mouth. So it does happen relatively frequently. It hasn't happened too much that recently, but it is a thing that does happen.
I'm just waiting for the scandal where somebody throws blood on a horse right as they're going in, just to Just to disqualify him, like, oh look, blood, oh, and it's like that's not the horse's blood.
Yeah. But they do. So some of the one thing that you will see, especially since that rule was brought in, is that a horse will come out of the arena, even if the judge hasn't seen anything. They will come out of the arena. They will ride to a little box.
Yeah.
Not like a box, but like a little pen with a fence. The rider will get off, in front of like a steward, and a vet will check the horse for blood immediately after going out of the arena. So, and the reason why the rider gets off in front of a steward, and there are stewards with them from the minute they leave the arena to the minute the vet starts this check, is so that they can prove that there has been no tampering. No one has tried to wipe away signs of blood on the horse. Or put on signs of blood on the horse, I guess. If that, I don't know why people would do that, but yeah. So they're very, very careful nowadays to stop these kinds of things with blood in particular, which doesn't completely solve the problem. And this is what we're sort of coming to, because the FEI's the most recent rule change that happened after British Dressage changed their rules, is that the FEI, the head honchos for equestrian sport, changed their dressage rules to make. You remember when we were talking about like the general picture that you should be seeing? How that was sort of in the fundamental dressage rules. So the FEI is in charge of that kind of thing, and that sort of overall picture, sort of guidance, was a rule for the longest of times, since the dressage rulebook was written, really, based on those scales of training and what horses at the time were going like when they had achieved all of those scales of training. And British Dressage, not British Dressage, the FEI revised their rulebook this year, and they have taken that rule about what the general picture should look like, and they have made it a guideline rather than a rule, which has got a lot of people very upset, because it now means that judges can mark according to their own personal idea of what dressage should look like, which in theory is fine, because everyone's been judging according to that official rulebook for so long that it's become ingrained in what their idea of what it should look like is. But when you go to these big international competitions, the judges are from all different countries, and
somebody might have
all over the place, and different people and different countries and different dressage, like national governing bodies, have different ideas of what that should look, what that general picture should look like. I know we've talked about the Dutch a little bit, and I don't want to sound like I am discriminatory against Dutch people, because I don't actually know any Dutch people really, and I'm sure they're lovely. But the Dutch dressage riders in particular were the ones who dived wholeheartedly into this roll curve thing, this very hyper collected sort of style of riding, which was the other British dressage rule change that happened this year. I knew I was forgetting one. They've made that against their rules because it's a welfare issue. So that sort of level of hyper collection is against British dressage rules as well, but not against FEI rules now. So the Dutch riders were the ones who dived sort of wholeheartedly into that style of riding, and because they were the top of the top at the time, that was what made it fashionable, because the Dutch were doing it and they're getting the gold medal, so everyone should be doing it. And they are also the last riders to cling on to it. When you watch, I don't know if it's just me because I've watched so much dressage now, but when you watch things like the Olympics and like the World Equestrian Games, the World Championships, the Europeans, that kind of thing. When you're watching those kinds of competitions, you can tell what country a person is from based on the way they ride. Or more specifically, you can always pick out the Dutch riders. There's a couple of countries where you can always pick out who is from that country, and it's the Dutch because they ride really collected and tucked in and tense, and the Portuguese because they ride their native horses. Which, like, I love the Portuguese, they're great, I love those horses. But yeah, you can always tell who the Dutch riders are because they, even if they're not riding in that roller style anymore, they are riding very collected and very tucked in and very, like, tense. They always look really dramatic. Their horses have a really high knee action. They often will do these very strange looking extended trots where their knees come up very high and their front legs flick outwards very dramatically. It looks like when you see someone doing like a flamenco or a tango or something, but in trot. But their hind legs don't seem to be really going anywhere. They look very dramatic, but yeah, they look like they're not really going anywhere. And their horses are always swishing their tails, and they very rarely look happy with what they're doing. But the Dutch, they still do quite well for themselves in terms of competition. And because we have to have judges from all over the world at international competitions, there are often Dutch judges on these like judging boards at international competitions, and they're scattered across the arena, but there's normally at least one judge or pair of judges, because sometimes you have two judges in one box, that are from the Netherlands. And because the concern of a lot of people is that because a lot of riders and judges are sort of clinging to these sort of outdated and disproven ways of riding, that by the FEI making the rule of what it should look like guidelines, those judges and those riders are then given more scope to say, well, my way is the best way, even though it's not. So, like, to my mind, it's kind of a very petty quibble to have, because it is still in the rule book. It's not like they've wiped it out entirely. They've just changed the wording of it slightly, so it's a guideline instead of a rule. So I don't think it's as huge an issue as a lot of people are making out that it is, but it is something for us to watch and to sort of look at and see how it's working. Personally, I will not subscribe to that change. In my mind, that is what dressage should be. And I have my own sort of idea of what dressage is meant to look like and meant to be like. And talking to a lot of people, it sounds to me like people think it's a very idealized view of what dressage is meant to be like. But, you know, it's only an idealized utopian idea of what it's meant to be like until people start believing in it and actually putting it into practice, right? Like if I tell enough people that your horse is meant to be happy when you're doing dressage, then maybe eventually people will start believing me.
Wait a minute, they're supposed to be happy and not just working? Whoa!
Well, okay, no, that's a bit of an exaggeration, because everyone wants their horses to be happy. It's a bit like, you know, you have a dog, right? Like, you want your dog to be happy.
Yeah, she suddenly decided she has to be in my face right this moment.
So that's sort of where I'm coming from in dressage, where you can't force them to do things. You have to be nice about it.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't get, because a lot of people will say horse riding isn't a sport, the horse does all the work, you're just sitting there. If you just sit on the back of a horse and do absolutely nothing. The horse will not move.
Well,
You wouldn't do anything.
me and some of those people who say horse riding isn't a sport also like sit in front of NASCAR all day long watching a car race.
Well,
and
we,
it's like,
we don't get
how is that
NASCAR over here. But
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
they're normally the type of people who watch Formula One or darts or
Yeah.
snooker or something. And it's like, those aren't sports either if horse riding isn't a sport. But I think one of the best ways to sort of visualize this, I guess, is that when you are watching horse sports on TV, you will almost never see someone riding at that level who is overweight.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a I don't mean that in a BMI sense. Like, the most of the rugby team are considered obese by the BMI scale. I am fully aware that like different people have different body types and everything. But the amount of strength that it takes to do this sport, you will never see someone doing especially that sort of level who does not have an insane amount of muscle and core strength and endurance and like fitness. And that is why, for the most part, the people that you see at like the Olympics, horse riding is their career. They do that as a day job.
Oh.
There was a girl from Singapore in the dressage at the Olympics who's a dentist as a day job or something. She doesn't like, riding is not her profession. She does that on the side, and that was like the story of the Olympics because it's unheard of. It's like any kind of sports person, you don't do that on this, like, just casually.
Yeah.
If you're going to compete at that level, that's your life. And you have to put so much time and effort into becoming the fittest version of yourself to like the level, like what you need for that sport. So like for dressage, a lot of it is muscular strength, things like your core, your thighs, your upper body, that kind of thing, has to be very, very strong because you are the one piloting that horse and getting the horse to go where it needs to go. And most horses weigh upwards of 0.5 ton.
Yeah.
So
Or more.
Your legs and abs and like shoulders and whatever, that is what is controlling 0.5 ton of weight and muscle that sometimes doesn't want to do what you want it to do. So the amount of strength that it takes to do that sport is immense. And the fact that, like, for dressage especially, you have to do it without looking like you're moving. You have to hold yourself incredibly still.
If the rider is training the horse, that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
That is serious. That's the serious work. It may not look like it when they hit the field, but it's all the prep.
Yeah, it is. It's so much work. It's early mornings, it's late nights, it's slogging through the mud, it's doing things in the dark, it's everything smelling like shit but you don't notice because you're so used to it. It's pulling hay out of your hair when you've been at a meeting with people for 3 hours. It's being out in the wet, in the cold, in the boiling sun. It's all the work behind the scenes. It's such an intense level of commitment and physical intensity that I think a lot of people don't realize. Partially because you never look like you're doing anything, but that's the point. You only look like you're not doing anything if you're working really hard. I'm trying to think if there's anything coming up particularly soon in the dressage world. I know that so the FEI does World Cup classes very like across the year. It's sort of a league type thing, and so they're doing them across the world and across the year. So there was one in Germany last weekend. I don't know when the next one is, but they do quite often post highlights on their website or on social media. There are websites where you can live stream them for free or relatively low cost / free trial. But other than that, we have missed the World Championships. That was last year. I went for the Dressage to Music. It was a lot of fun. I recommend if you ever get the chance. It used to be called the World Equestrian Games, and I think the biggest problem that the FEI has had is that they've changed it, so it's no longer the World Equestrian Games. They've split it up, which is very sad to me. But we haven't got that to look out for until after the next Olympics now. But yeah, so in case anyone was ever curious about the petty drama that is the dressage world, there you go. This has been dressage rule changes in the past several years. To be honest, the drama that is happening at the moment is mild compared to the stuff that happened sort of 2012, 2013, where they changed the rules about helmets. So you should count yourself lucky that you weren't getting this like 10 years ago. Because that was hilarious. That was like, you know when you had all the anti-vaxxers because of COVID going like, I'm not gonna give myself this vaccine, it's gonna kill me sort of thing. It was like a similar sort of level of absolute insanity going on when they changed the rules about helmets, because it used to be that in like Grand Prix, etc., sort of level dressage, you could wear a top hat and tails. You didn't have to wear a helmet. And then they changed the rules and said that you had to wear a helmet because it was a safety issue.
Yeah.
And all those traditionalists are coming out of the woodwork like, you can't change those rules. It's tradition. You have to wear a top hat.
Oh well.
Oh well. Thank you, Charlotte Dujardin, for making everyone see sense.
Make it fashionable helmets. Come on.
Yeah, well, she made hers all blingy, and then all the girls wanted to wear them. It was great. But so in conclusion, horse people are incredibly petty. They don't like rule changes. Any changes to how things work happen incredibly slowly and incredibly begrudgingly. But we love it anyway. Basically, just if you are a horsey person, you do you. As long as your horse is happy and healthy and you are working together, and there is harmony between the two of you, you will be okay at dressage. You don't need a fancy horse. You don't need one of these.
Yeah.
You don't need to be a millionaire with a top class horse that's like out of Totalas or whatever to do a good job at dressage. I have got quite literally an Irish bog pony, and I regularly beat out the warm bloods. So don't listen to the haters who say that you need to go onto a horse at 13. You don't. Get a pony. They don't break as easily. They cost less money. And don't be afraid to buy a youngster who doesn't look like much, because they'll normally turn out okay. It's the ones who look really impressive as youngsters that are normally like, they normally burn out really quickly. It's a little bit like that whole gifted kid thing where, like, you know, if you get told when you're a child that, oh, you're so gifted, and then you start to grow up and you get told you're not achieving your potential. And then you get to like 25 and you're just depressed. and have made absolutely nothing of yourself. So thank you for listening to Hey I Like. You can find me on Tumblr mostly, not gonna lie.
Okay.
You can find me on Tumblr at Storm Leviosa, all one word, no caps. I am fully aware that it is a Harry Potter URL, as someone sent me a private message to tell me and then blocked me. That has been my username for donkey's years. I cannot be bothered to change it. It means absolutely nothing to me. It is just words. Do not support J.K. Rowling. She is a TERF who is anti-Scottish independence. But yes, so you can find me on Tumblr at Storm Leviosa. But I don't often post horsey things on there, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, for all that it is my longest lasting love affair, I say longest lasting as if I have ever had any other. But like, I don't post a lot of it on Tumblr because most of horse Tumblr is just pictures, and like, for all that pictures are really cool, it's like that's not what we're on Tumblr for. We're on Tumblr for stupid reasons. But I figured out something that I can shout out that has absolutely nothing to do with me. That is vaguely to do with dressage. Okay, hear me out. I have an author friend who, their first book comes out this year, but their second book is called Dressage Dragons.
Oh.
And I was a beta reader / proofreader for it, back when it was still in the very first drafting stages. So a lot of the dressage knowledge comes straight from me. My author friend is not a dressage person. They just grew up surrounded by a lot of very snotty horse girls who tried to explain what dressage was, and then they went, you know what, let's make that exact dynamic, but the dressage is done on dragons. And when I heard this idea, I was like, why the hell did I not think of that first?
Are these
that
winged
is exactly
dragons or unwinged?
Kind of book. So they wrote this book called Dressage Dragons, and it comes out next year, I believe. They are called BL Radley. They are also on Tumblr, so if you want to go find them, you can. I believe there is at least one passage, I think it's potentially the one about dressage to music, and like the rules about it, that is almost verbatim from our DMs. So that's fun. I am by association in a book. So if you want to hear more about stupid dressage drama, but you're not particularly into horses, or you are really into dressage and you are into horses, but you are also exactly like me and have my exact reading tastes and were a dragon person as a teenager.
Yeah.
This is the book for you. Also, if you're gay. It is incredibly gay in every single way. It's beautiful. It is, hands down, I wish I could have written this book. It's beautiful. So big shout out to my good friend Radley, who wrote the book that I wish I could write. And it comes out next year. So go look for that if you are interested in that kind of thing. That is my shout out for this episode. But aside from that, that is not all I have to say, but all I have time to say. I will have to say goodbye now. So we can find Hey I Like on Tumblr at Hey I Like. No surprises there. All one word, all lowercase. All the episode links are up there. You can also find us on Spotify and on Google Podcasts. If you have any questions, please don't go to me directly. Please go to the blog for the podcast. Our Ask box is always open. I'm happy to answer those questions. Or I think we have Q&As at the end of episodes now. There's an option on Anchor where you can allow people to ask questions directly at the ends of episodes, which is nice. So you can use that too. But yeah, I think that is about everything that we have to say in terms of wrap up. So it is goodbye from me. I have loved talking about my horses. Thank you so much for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end, congrats! You are officially much stronger than half of our friends. If you are enjoying listening to this podcast, please subscribe to get notified when we update, or follow us on Tumblr at HeyILike, all lowercase. That's all for now. See you next time on Hey, I Like.